Hey, just checking in. This is going to be kind of a boring episode, but also very informative. So if you're into this electric build and you want to learn more about how I'm actually going to make this all work, then stay tuned. If not, then just skip this episode. It's just a lot of me talking. I wanted to give you guys a little bit of an update since I've been working on planning out the boat and ordering parts and talking to companies and trying to get people on board and all of that while waiting for my solar panels to arrive and helping Melly move. I thought I'd make a little bit of a video to bring you guys up to speed as to what my actual plan is for an electric sailboat. Now, many of you are adamant that I should keep my diesel motor, and I understand the draw of that. It's very simple and is proven technology, and a lot of people do it. However, for me, this boat is a 5-year plan minimum. So at 5 years, I feel like that keeping it diesel just isn't worth it anymore. Keeping that motor alive and spending all that money on gas and having to hunt down gas all the time, and instead of just being more off-grid, which is what I really like. So I decided I would go with a full electric system. Now, to make a full electric system, there's a lot of complicated stuff going on, and there isn't one solution that works just for anybody and everybody. So I thought I'd break down my thought process of why I went the ways I went. First of all, the biggest problem with an electric sailboat is power storage. An electric vehicle of any kind, power storage. If you're looking at lead acid, AGM, or 6-volt batteries, they're the cheapest option. They run about $155 per kilowatt hour of storage, but they have a poor lifespan and they're very heavy at 95 pounds per kilowatt. Another option is to go with the lithium LiPo batteries. They're a very high cost battery at $310 per kilowatt hour, but they have an amazing lifespan and they're very light at about 13 pounds per kilowatt hour. What I did is I got a really good deal online on secondhand NMC, or lithium nickel manganese cobalt oxide batteries. They're out of a shipping container robotic truck that they use at ports and stuff. I paid about $250 per kilowatt hour. They have very good lifespan, about 10,000 plus cycles. They're very light, not quite as light as LiPo, but 16 pounds per kilowatt hour. And I bought 22.5 kilowatt hours to start off the battery bank. For me, that's a good amount to just get started on. I think if I make this world cruising boat eventually, it'll be at least 100 kilowatt hours per onboard. From there, we got to talk about the motor, because that's a lot of battery in certain applications, and that's really not very much battery in other applications. So before we can even talk about the motor, we got to talk about where we want to put the motor. So we got two options. We can either go inboard or outboard. An inboard motor is out of the way, and it requires two motors, but that adds the cost, but it also adds redundancy. It allows us to do a 1-to-1 ratio, which is really nice, and it gives us space enough to put pretty much any motor we want in there. Now, in my particular application, it also has a little confusion because it means I have to drill holes in my hull and thread in spots for my actual propellers to go through, and my drive shafts and everything, because I don't have any of that on my boat right now. So the other option is an outboard motor. It's easily removable, so you can remove the entire motor and do work on it. You can turn the motor to get side thrust available in tight quarters. You can either use 1 or 2 outboard motors. It's good for a 1-to-2 ratio usually if you're going to use regular engine outboard motors. So they run anywhere between 1.8 to ratio or a 2 ratio. The problems is it has a smaller motor space available, so some of the bigger motors won't work in there. Also, depending on how you have it set up, it's not necessarily as efficient. It really depends on your boat. In my particular case, I have a Wharram boat, which are designed primarily to use outboard motors, and that's why I'm leaning that way, although I haven't bought anything yet, so that's still up in the air. Alright, so let's talk about motors. There are a lot of different kinds of motors out there, and for my applications, I'm looking at about 30 horsepower moves my boat reasonably well. So that's either 2 15 horsepower motors or 1 30 horsepower motor. A 30 horsepower is roughly 22 kilowatt motor. That doesn't really perfectly line up, like it's not a perfect comparison. Electric motors are really confusing depending on the kind of electric motor you have. They have like continuous draw and usage, and then they can have like these peak thrusting moments. So I could have basically, it's the same as having like a diesel motor that was, say, 15 horsepower diesel motor that could crank out 15 horsepower day in and day out. But then, like, if you really hit the juice, you could get like 35 horsepower out of it for like, I don't know, 90 seconds or something like that. And also the torque was available instantly. So for some applications, the torque is more important than horsepower. It's really hard to convey exactly how this motor will compare to a gas or diesel motor, but I'll do my best. All right, so the first up is the industrial induction motor. Now this one's a little attractive because the industrial induction motor is cheap. They've been making them for years. They run usually 3-phase AC power. 230 volt is kind of the average, and then you can run up from there. The single phase motors tend to be a smaller horsepower, smaller kilowatt rating, and they're not very useful for my particular application, but all the stuff I've been looking at, 3-phase. Problems is very heavy and very big. Upside is very efficient. These are 94 or 96% efficient often. So attractive, however, given the size and weight, I'd have to put them as inboard motors, which means I have to buy 2 of them. And when you have to buy 2 motors, it really does drive up the price a little bit, especially when you consider that you have to buy either a 3-phase inverter and a VFD or a higher cost AC motor controller. This system will run anywhere between $3,000 to $6,000 to set up. So that's just a, kind of a fairly high price, but it's only really considering the fact that I have to do 2. If I was on a monohull, I'd probably go this route because the high efficiency, it's really easy to run in regen, and you'd only have to buy 1 motor, and given the fact that you're dealing with these bigger motors, it makes it a lot more affordable, a lot more useful. Now, I could also put them into outboard motors if I was getting really small ones. There are small ones that will fit in there. But the problem is, again, I'm dealing with all air-cooled, so that means I'd have to set up a kind of fan system, and I'm really leaning towards water-cooled. And again, you're doubling up on stuff, so I found that the AC motor controllers, they don't get that cheap, They're still like $300 or $400 each minimum, and that's for the really cheap knockoff brand stuff. I mean, the nicer stuff is closer to $1,000. So it's an option. I'm thinking about it. The induction motor is certainly very attractive, but I'm also looking at other stuff too. One of the other ones that a lot of people use is a DC motor, a brushed DC motor. These are really cheap. They've been proven in the application. People have been using them for years. This was the go-to motor for the last 15 years, 20 years of any electric vehicles. The problem is they're not super efficient at 85% roughly, sometimes up to 90%, but they're very small and they're very cheap. They also tend to wear down. Those brushes tend to not fare up so well over a long period of time. I found most of the applications are air-cooled, which also, given the fact that things are making contact with each other, there's some wear, there's a lot of like debris inside the motors that builds up over time. They generally run up to about 4,000 RPM. They produce sparks, and yeah, air-cooled. So not the most attractive option, but given their cheap price, I could get a 1 or 2 motor combo for anywhere between 2,000 to 4,000 with the motor controller and everything else set up. And the fact that there's also a lot of other people who've already done that gives me a little bit of confidence, right? Now here's another option that I didn't think was an option until just recently. I used to do a lot of stuff with quadcopters. I used to build my own racing quadcopters and stuff. And they use DC brushless motors, usually outboard. They're called Outrunners. That means that the whole casing on the outside spins with fixed magnets on it, and then the stator sits inside of it. They also have in-runner application ones as well. Now, they've been used in RC stuff, and the interesting thing is because the RC market has exploded so much in the last 10 years, it's really brought the price of these things down. They've mass-produced these motors all over the place, and now they have applications for agricultural quadcopters that run really low RPM, really strong, big motors. They have applications for paramotoring, electric paramotoring, and those guys run similar, very big motors, very small, slower RPMs compared to some of the quadcopters that are running up to like 20,000 RPM and higher. They also have water-cooled motorboat motors that are getting close to the wattage that I need to run my motors, and they're already water cooled and they're very small and efficient. And lastly, they also have ones for small ATVs, golf carts, and especially go-karts. So these are racing type motors, and they are right around that kind of range, anywhere between 15 to 20 kilowatts. They're 92% efficient, give or take. They run anywhere between 3,000 to well over 20,000 RPM. You can get water-cooled ones fairly easily, and they're very, very small and light. Like, these guys are tiny compared to the induction motors. It's a whole other ball game. The induction motors I'm looking at, like the smallest ones are like 2 foot by a foot by a foot, and they weigh like, you know, well over 100 pounds, probably 200 pounds. These DC ones are like the size of a melon or smaller. They're tiny. And they also have very modern tech, because this is very new and upcoming kind of like system. So it's very attractive, but hasn't been used in this application very much before. The benefits is, because they're being purchased so widely by DIYers all over the place, there's a much higher market for it, much easier to get them. I like the idea of a much lighter weight system, and yeah, I'm looking at it. So maybe a couple of those in either 1 or 2 outboard motors. They're also very cheap, the brushless ones. They brought the price way down. And if I go with that smaller motors, I put 2 of them and 2 outboards, which I can probably get for nearly free, the legs anyways. It really does bring the price down. I can get water-cooled ESCs for them with, say, electronic speed controllers, and I can also get water-cooled motors themselves. So let's talk about charging. All that battery and all that motor is real great, but if you can only run it once, then it's not really worth it. You got to be able to charge it over and over and over again. That's when it really starts to shine. Now, in order to effectively charge a system of that size, you need a lot of charging potential. Most people will plug it into a dock somewhere or run a generator. I'm not so keen on that. I'd rather a system that's constantly charging, a system I don't have to think about or worry about, a system that's quiet. That's a really big one. And you know, that doesn't use fossil fuels, so I never have to go back to shore and reload on fossil fuels. The big goal for me is to be able to just have water and electricity and power and movement for my boat without ever having to haul stuff from shore to do it. So what did I get? Well, I bought 20 solar panels, which for a sailboat is a lot of freaking solar panels, and they're not small ones. It totals about 430 square feet, which is bigger than the apartment I lived in before I got into van life. And it's about 4 times the size of the square footage of my van. So it's a lot of space. But I get 6,600 watts of brand new solar panels. I got a really good deal on those guys through my buddy Sam, which you've seen on the channel before. He'll be helping me with that setup. He also scored me a 100 amp MPPT solar charge controller, which will run out at 48 volts, giving me at maximum charging voltage exactly 6,600 watts. Currently I have 1 wind turbine, which you guys have already seen. I'm looking at buying at least 1 more, maybe 2 more. And that's basically for those days where we're getting wind at night, getting a nice trickle charge in, enough to slowly bring the motor back up, you know, or if we get a lot of cloudy days back to back, it helps compensate during storms and other applications where you want to sit around and use your house and your power. Given the fact that we're not using fossil fuels on board at all, I want to make sure that I can always generate electricity no matter what. That is the power system. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is my power organization and why I've kind of like leaning certain ways with certain things. I'd like to water cool everything I can. For me, it's an energy waste to just pump heat off into the air and let it escape. I would rather conserve all the heat that my electronics are producing and pump it into my water tank. I'd like my freshwater tank to always be a warm freshwater tank. So any drinking water we would keep aside in the cooler or something like that. And then all the taps would just run warm all the time. So that means I'd be water cooling the motor controller, the inverter, the battery banks are all water cooled. I'll be water cooling. The fridge runs on a water cooler system as well. Yeah, just a lot of different items. Probably even an air conditioner eventually will be running on a water cooling system. All of that will pump that heat and hot water back into the water tank. and keep the water tank at a nice warm temperature. Hopefully it's warm enough that we can just have a warm shower with it. You know, that'd be nice. My battery bank is already set up in a 12S configuration, which is nearly 48 volts. I can change it over to a 13S configuration fairly easily. I'm looking at that, but it really depends on the kind of motor I get. If I'm looking at motors that are set up specifically for 48 volt, then I would go for the 13S config. If I'm looking at the DC brushless applications, they have a lot of motors that are specifically set up for 12S configurations, so I would keep them as 12S if that were the case. Because I'm running lithium-based batteries in series, if you run them and you unbalance them, then there's the potential for explosion, or at least damaging the cells. So that's something you want to make sure that you avoid. So I'll have redundant systems, battery monitoring systems, to ensure that the battery is always running in the right voltage and is nice and safe. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the inverter. I haven't bought an inverter yet. I need at least 4,000 watts of pure sine wave, and that's a pretty expensive inverter. I'm looking at certain inverters that include chargers as well, so that if I want to run an emergency generator, which I do, I don't have to buy a purely DC generator in order to get the high amperage charge that I'm looking for. So with a 4,000 watt pure sine wave inverter charger combo, I probably get a charger that, you know, can charge back nearly 4,000 watts, some of them 3,000, 2,000 watts of charge. So I would just be looking for a generator that does roughly that, maybe a little bit more, and enable me to maybe plug something else in at the same time for emergency applications. Again, safety is a very big concern of mine on blue water vessel. So yeah, the idea with this is you have a lot of redundancy and a lot of self-sufficiency. That's really the big goals. You can make a nice, safe blue water vessel that can support yourself like on a desert island if you want indefinitely, so long as you can keep collecting food. You can make water, power, all of that stuff, and just motor along too, you know. And the fact that I'm building all of this myself means I can cut it up later on and do whatever I want with it. And I always know how to repair it. So that's a very big plus for me. So yeah, that is the plan for my electrical system. I haven't bought a motor controllers, or any of that yet. All I have is batteries and a charging system. I don't have an inverter. I mean, there's so many electronics still to sort out, but we're getting there. We're getting close. So I'm very excited for this system, partly because of how green it is, but also because of just how self-sufficient it is. Like I said, I'm very excited to not have to haul stuff from shore to keep my life afloat and keep my life going. And I like the idea of being out in the middle of the Pacific and just getting boatloads of sunshine and just going and sitting in a doldrum. And instead of sitting in a doldrum for 2 weeks, I can just motor because I'm making fuel as I'm sitting there in the sunshine. So I can still motor 8 hours a day if I want to. And so yeah, that would be very attractive. Basically, at the current system, the way it's going to be set up, I'll get about 3 hours at 4 knots of motoring, 3 to 4 hours. And then with electric motors, the higher you ramp that up, the more electricity you burn at an exponential rate. So if you're only going 1 knot, it's going to be very efficient. I mean, you can motor for a really long time. But if you want to go 4 knots, you're going to get less distance because it brings it down. If you want to go 8 knots, it's possible, but it's going to bring that range down greatly. So yeah, that's the system as it stands with the current battery bank. I'll be quadrupling that eventually. So I mean, just take that number and times it by 4, and you'll see what I'm pretty much aiming at for my end goal with this boat is to have 100 kilowatt hours on board, like a Tesla car, and that would give me over 8 hours of motoring at 4 knots, and you know, you'd be able to motor overnight. That's basically the idea. So yeah, that's it. That's all I want to talk about. If you guys got questions, I'll do my best to answer them in the comments. I understand a lot of you guys are older guys and you love your diesel, and that's cool, but I'm trying to break a few new boundaries with this, and it's just what I'm thinking. It's going to be a big one, going to be a scary one, and it's very complicated to wrap my head around it, and it overwhelms me all the time, but I think when it's built, it's going to be one amazing, amazing boat, and I'm very excited for that. So thanks for your support, thanks for watching, and I hope this brings you guys up to speed. Cheers.